Joining me now is Democratic Georgia Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock. Senator Reverend, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I want to put up that picture of Governor Brian Kemp signing this law in a room full of white men. And here's what he had to say about the law shortly before that ceremony.
So we're actually expanding the right to vote in Georgia. Now, you're not hearing that from the other side, but that's what the truth is. So we're securing the vote. I think most people want that, whether they're Democrat, Republican, or somewhere in between. Everybody wants to have confidence in the elections. I believe that's what we're doing in Georgia.
What's your response to that, sir?
He knows better. And unfortunately, Georgia has a long history of voter suppression. And when I say a long history, I mean in recent years. And certainly it has ramped up with this bill that he signed into law the other night, as you pointed out, in the presence of all white men. And on the other side was a state legislator elected by her people to represent them. And she was lightly knocking on the door and was arrested and charged with 2 felonies. Georgia needs to understand, that is, those in the state legislature, the governor, that it wasn't just this state legislator who's a member of my church, and I went to see about her that night. She's not the only one knocking at that door. The people are knocking at the door of their democracy, and they will not be denied. They're raising their voices. I'm going to do everything I can to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the For the People Act so that we can expand our democracy rather than contract it. The governor is taking us back. We intend to go forward.
And I want to ask about that legislation in a moment. But first, you are the first black man from Georgia and the first black Democrat from a former Confederate state ever elected to the U.S. Senate. You have to run again next year to keep your seat. Do you think this law restricting voting rights in your state is a backlash to your election specifically?
Well, you know, I am very clear that this is not about me. This is really about preserving the voices of the people in their democracy. And I honestly think, Dana, that politicians focused on their own political ambition is what's gotten us here in the first place.
Yeah.
You have legislators who are running scared. And so rather than having the people select their the politicians are trying to cherry pick their voters. This is an assault on the covenant that we have with one another as an American people, and it's my job to protect it.
And I understand what you mean. I guess maybe the question isn't about you personally, but about what you represent.
Oh, I think, you know, we've seen this over the history of our country. Our democracy expands and it contracts. We have this amazing idea, when you think about the long march of human history, this experiment in self-government, one person, one vote. And it was stated in the charter documents of our nation, but we've always had to fight for it. When Jefferson offered up those ideals that all men are created equal, I guess he meant all men because women weren't included. People of color, black people have had to fight for their vote. And honestly, it is disconcerting that here we are again, fighting for what's basic, but we will not be worn down. We intend to stand up to this moment. And I think it's important that people understand that while race certainly is a part of this equation, and young people and others are being marginalized, at the end of the day, this is about our democracy. This is about the covenant we have with one another as an American people. We have big arguments in our country about the direction, about the things that we need to do. But at the end of the day, the four most powerful words in a democracy are the people have spoken. And we cannot allow politicians to silence the people, crowd them out of their own democracy.
So let's talk about some of the potential solutions for what you're talking about. President Biden, of course, called efforts to restrict voting in your state of Georgia and elsewhere an atrocity. He said it was Jim Crow in the 21st century. But he also said the next big initiative is still going to be infrastructure. So should the president prioritize federal voting rights and legislation to do that over infrastructure or anything else?
Oh, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We've got to work on the infrastructure of our country, our roads and our bridges, and we've got to work on the infrastructure of our democracy. After all, the only reason we're able to get anything done, have the prospects of getting more done this Congress, is because people were able to show up and express their voices in their democracy. We wouldn't have passed the American Rescue Plan had the people of Georgia not stood up in the way that they did. Historic turnout, and as a result of that, we were able to pass a historic piece of legislation, shots in people's arms, checks in their pockets, and so we've got to do both of those things.
Yeah, and that makes sense, but a president's time is limited, and in 2006, the Senate voted 98-0 to reauthorize the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Many of those Republican yeses are still there. So does President Biden need to get personally involved, step in, get Republicans and Democrats in a room to find bipartisan legislation and a path forward?
Oh, I think the president is engaged on this issue. And when I've talked to him, he's agreed that voting rights are foundational, that this is the work we have to do. And I have to tell you, that I was heartened when I heard him speak so clearly about how urgent this is, recognizing that this is Jim Crow 2.0. It reminded me of another president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, when he saw what was going on in the South, people standing up for their rights, he gave that famous address to the nation, and he ended it by lifting up the words from the anthem of the movement. And he said, "And we shall overcome."
And he
his words, go ahead.
He also twisted arms big time to get that done.
Absolutely.
So does President Biden need to follow that lead as well?
I think that the president is very much engaged, and we're having these conversations all the time. And I think you're going to see that we are going to find a way to secure voting rights and pass the kind of legislation that expands rather than contracts our democracy.
And I know you have said that the focus should be on Republicans and not on changing the filibuster. And I hear you on that. But the reality is, unless Republicans get on board, the filibuster is a big obstacle to this legislation becoming law. At his press conference, President Biden indicated he's open to some reforms and said he considers the filibuster a relic of Jim Crow, but he still won't call for eliminating it outright. Does he need to do that?
I think that we have to pass voting rights no matter what. And the reason why I have insisted that we talk to our Republican sisters and brothers on the other side of the aisle is because if we don't do anything else in the Senate, we have to stand up for the democracy. The filibuster at the end of the day is about minority rights in the Senate. How are you going to insist on protecting minority rights in the Senate while refusing to protect minority rights in the society?
So is that a yes?
So the ball is in their court. They could vote the bill up, but if they don't, we have to pass voting rights no matter what.
Georgia-based corporations like Coca-Cola and Delta are facing intense criticism for not doing more to publicly oppose this law. Organizations like the PGA, the MLB are also under pressure to move high-profile events like the Masters and the All-Star Game out of your state of Georgia. Does corporate America need to be more forceful in denouncing this law? Should boycotts be on the table?
I think we all have to use our voices. And I have to tell you, as the pastor of Ebenezer Church, I've seen these corporations falling over themselves every year around the time of the King holiday, celebrating Dr. King. And yes, I think that the way to celebrate Dr. King is to stand up for what he represented, voting rights. And so we will see how all of that plays out. But I'm focused on what we can do in the United States Senate. We have a responsibility to make sure that we secure the franchise. And when we do that, we protect the democracy. And I think also we set the climate for business. We want to see people prosper, particularly who have been suffering for months under this pandemic. We need to pass this legislation, protect the right of the people to be heard in their own democracy, and to make sure that Georgia is open for business and open for voting. So
no boycotts?
Listen, I'm not focused on that. I am focused
Okay.
on what I can do as a United States Senator.
One last question before we go. Today is Palm Sunday, the start of Holy Week. You are leaving here. You said as you mentioned, you are going to lead your congregation in worship at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. What's your message going to be after this incredibly difficult year?
Well, you know, it's Palm Sunday, and Jesus confronts the powers, and we all have a decision to make. There was a governor that he confronts in that moment named Pilate, and the governor has a decision to make. And I think that all of us have a decision to make. Are we going to stand on the side of truth and righteousness and justice? Are we going to stand up on the right side of history? This is a defining moment in the American nation, and all of us have a role to play.
Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.